hello to our dear viewers. This story may make you feel powerful and inspired, but I hope you won't stop there. It serves as a reminder that justice is not just a decision in a courtroom. It is a long-term battle that each of us must take part in. It is the fight of unity, of standing up to say no to injustice and yes to the values we believe in. Now let's dive into this story. Rick Thompson had always prided himself on his instincts. As a police officer in Detroit, his job required quick judgments, and he believed he was adept at making them. However, there was something about his instincts that was tainted by his assumptions, by the images that his mind conjured up the moment he saw something that didn't fit his narrow view of the world. It was an ordinary afternoon, or at least it seemed like one. The hum of Detroit's streets was interrupted by the growl of a powerful engine, a sound so out of place, so foreign, that Rick immediately took notice. He turned his patrol car on a dime, his eyes scanning for the source of the noise. And there it was, a sleek red Ferrari, the kind of car that didn't belong on these streets. At least, not in Rick's mind. But the sight of that car stirred something within him, a familiar mix of self-satisfaction, suspicion, and deep-rooted bias. It wasn't the first time he had seen someone cruising through a neighborhood like this, in a car that screamed excess. It was always the same, young, black, and wearing their wealth like a badge of dishonor. In Rick's world, luxury was not earned, but stolen, and anyone who flaunted it was guilty of something. "Another one," Rick muttered to himself, his voice thick with disdain, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He wasn't sure why it bothered him so much. Maybe it was the way the car gleamed in the sunlight, or the way it seemed to mock the poverty that surrounded it. Whatever the reason, Rick's instinct was clear. Pull her over. His heart pounded as he turned on the siren, the flashing red lights illuminating the interior of his patrol car. The Ferrari's driver, black, young, and confident, kept driving, unfazed. She finally slowed and pulled over to the curb with the kind of grace that Rick couldn't quite understand. As he approached the car, he saw her sitting behind the wheel, calm and composed, a lawyer, he assumed based on her attire. He looked down at the business card on her passenger seat. Linda Johnson, equal. It didn't matter. She wasn't like him, and that, in Rick's mind, was enough to warrant suspicion. He reached her window and knocked lightly, the sound sharp against the silent tension between them. "Can I help you, officer?" Her voice was steady, with a touch of irritation, as though this was a routine she had dealt with before. Rick took a deep breath, letting his own assumptions form the words that would follow. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" His tone was direct, laced with judgment. Linda didn't flinch. She met his gaze and replied coolly, "I'm here on business." "Business?" Rick scoffed internally. "Business in a place like this?" He wasn't buying it. He demanded her license and registration, and when she handed them over without hesitation, his suspicion deepened. The paperwork checked out, but there was something in the back of his mind, a nagging voice telling him that something wasn't right. "You're coming with me," Rick announced, his voice taking on a more commanding tone. He wasn't going to let this one slip through his fingers, not without a deeper look into the car. Without reason, without probable cause, he ordered Linda out of the vehicle. As she stepped out, unfazed by his rough demeanor, he began his search. His hands rifled through the leather seats, the glove compartment, even under the floor mats. Nothing of interest, no drugs, no weapons, but Rick wasn't convinced. He wasn't ready to let go of his preconceived notion of what Linda should be. A young black woman in a Ferrari? She had to be hiding something. When his search yielded nothing, Rick's frustration grew. His mind scrambled for something, anything, to justify his actions. "You're coming with me," he repeated, as though the mere repetition of the words would make them true. He reached for his handcuffs, clicking them around Linda's wrists with cold precision. "On what grounds?" Linda's voice cut through the tension like a knife, calm but firm. Her defiance only seemed to fuel Rick's drive. This wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about proving himself right. At the police station, Rick's suspicions deepened. He was sure he had her now. With no evidence to back his claims, Rick interrogated Linda as if she were already guilty. His questions were laced with contempt, the kind of contempt that came from years of seeing people like Linda as nothing more than a stereotype. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" he sneered as he leaned in close, watching her every move. Linda's response was measured, unshaken. "I have nothing to hide, officer." Still, Rick persisted, his mind clouded by a haze of racial bias. He accused her of being a drug dealer, despite the lack of evidence. The situation, however, was far from over. News of the arrest spread like wildfire, drawing attention from the media and the public. Protests broke out, demanding Linda's release, rallying against the injustice of a system that seemed to be built on prejudice. Linda stood firm, speaking to the crowd with a calm but unyielding voice. "This fight for justice isn't over. It's only just begun." But it was Rick who would soon find himself facing the consequences of his actions. As the trial proceeded, the truth unraveled in a way that Rick could not have predicted. The media painted Linda as a hero, and soon, even those who once stood by Rick began to turn against him. In a moment of shocking revelation, Captain Harrison, a senior officer, came forward with testimony that exposed the deep-seated corruption within the police department. "What Officer Thompson and others have done is a betrayal of their oath," Harrison declared, his voice cutting through the tension in the courtroom. And in the wake of his downfall, Rick was left to grapple with his guilt, a guilt that would consume him as the truth came to light. In the end, Linda was more than a lawyer. She was a symbol of everything that needed to change, not just in Detroit, but in the system that had failed her and so many others like her. This was just the beginning. As Rick approached her car, Linda Johnson remained perfectly still, her hands resting on the steering wheel with the same poised confidence she had carried with her throughout her life. The contrast between them was immediate and striking. Rick's pulse quickened, his mind fueled by bias and suspicion, while Linda sat in her Ferrari, a symbol of success and hard work that others may have seen as a product of privilege, but for Linda it was the result of years of grinding determination. The roar of Rick's siren had been deafening, but Linda's focus remained unshaken. The shrill sound that echoed through the neighborhood only seemed to amplify her calmness. As though the world around her could be shaking and still, she would stand unflinching. When Rick's shadow finally loomed over her window, Linda's eyes met his with a quiet strength. There was no hesitation in her gaze, no fear, only a quiet resolve, as if she had already anticipated this moment and was ready for whatever would follow. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice even, steady, an island of calm in a sea of tension. Rick's question came out like a dart, sharp and without hesitation. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" His words were like a hammer, each syllable striking against Linda's calm, like a wave crashing against an immovable rock. We couldn't hear a move again for a few minutes. It had been 2 months since our family had moved from the local council home. But Linda, like the calm surface of an ocean before a storm, remained undisturbed. "I'm here on business," she responded, her voice clear, her posture unwavering, as though she were answering a routine question and not one that carried with it layers of injustice. There was no trace of defensiveness in her tone, no pleading for understanding, no apology for being there, because in Linda's mind, she had nothing to apologize for. Her presence in this neighborhood was legitimate, her purpose pure. Yet, as the silence lingered between them, Linda knew something far deeper was at play than a simple traffic stop. Rick's mind raced, and with each passing moment, the thoughts of privilege, of entitlement, clashed against the reality of Linda's quiet confidence. He had expected her to shrink, to waver under the weight of his authority, but she didn't, and that bothered him more than he cared to admit. In his mind, a young black woman driving a car like hers didn't belong here. Didn't belong anywhere, for that matter, except in a place he had imagined her to be, guilty. But Linda's composure was like a mirror, reflecting back Rick's own internal struggle, and with each beat of her calm demeanor, his assumptions crumbled, and the weight of his prejudice settled heavier on his shoulders. When he demanded her license and registration, Linda didn't flinch. She retrieved the documents with the same practiced ease of a professional who had dealt with such stops countless times. Her fingers brushed the papers with deliberate care, handing them over as though the action itself was a message, one of dignity, of standing tall despite the ugliness of the situation. She remained silent as Rick fumbled through the documents, hoping to find something to justify the flood of accusations running rampant in his mind. He couldn't understand how she seemed so calm, as if everything were normal, when he was certain he had a reason to stop her. But Linda wasn't about to give him anything more to hold on to. She knew the game that was being played, and she wasn't about to make it easier for him. "Are you in this neighborhood?" Rick asked again, as if his repetition would suddenly make her guilty. The words hung in the air like an accusation, thick with prejudice. But Linda, with the precision of someone who had been forced to navigate a world filled with assumptions about her based on her skin color, answered simply, "I told you, I'm here on business." There was no anger, no frustration in her tone, just a quiet insistence that her word was enough. Her words were like the steady beat of a drum, unrelenting in their truth, and for a moment it seemed as though they cut through the fog of Rick's assumptions. It wasn't just the words themselves that were powerful, it was the way Linda carried them. She wasn't just a woman, she was the embodiment of resilience. Her presence was a metaphor for the unwavering strength required to succeed against odds that would break most people. As Rick demanded that she exit the vehicle, Linda didn't resist. She opened the door with the kind of movement that suggested not only compliance but grace. The act of stepping out of the Ferrari, her heels clicking on the pavement like a steady march forward, was a statement in itself. She wasn't afraid, she wasn't worried. If anything, she was prepared for the storm of bias that would come. Rick began his search, his fingers rifling through the car, looking for a reason, any reason to confirm his suspicions. The more he looked, the more Linda seemed to grow, standing taller in the face of his unwarranted aggression. Linda knew that he was looking for something to validate his warped view of the world, a world where people like her were always the problem, the outsider, the other. But Linda had long ago learned the hard way that to stand in a system that was never built for her meant to be questioned, scrutinized, and misunderstood. Yet here she stood, unwavering, as if for very existence was a challenge to everything Rick believed. When Rick finished his search and found nothing, his frustration mounted. But Linda, she remained composed. She wasn't concerned with proving anything to him, because she had nothing to prove. The truth was already on her side, and that truth, despite Rick's disbelief, would be her shield. "Are you done yet, officer?" she asked, her voice still calm but with an edge of finality. Rick's response was to place her in handcuffs, still convinced that something was wrong, that she was somehow guilty of something he hadn't yet found. But Linda was no longer concerned with him or his misplaced sense of authority. She had learned long ago that the only thing that mattered was the fight for justice, and that was a fight she would not back down from. As Rick drove her to the station, her calmness never wavered. Inside, a storm was brewing, not within Linda, but within Rick himself. Every minute he spent in her presence, every ounce of certainty he lost, chipped away at the walls of his prejudice. Linda Johnson was more than just a lawyer. She was a force, a symbol of all the things Rick had failed to see. Until now. And in her calmness, she was speaking volumes, reminding the world that even in the face of injustice, there is strength in standing firm, in holding your ground with grace, and in knowing that no matter how the system tries to break you, your truth will always be your armor. The tension in the air was palpable, thick, with an unspoken animosity that seemed to vibrate between Linda and Officer Rick Thompson. The sun had dipped behind the horizon, but its heat still clung to the asphalt, mixing with the rising heat of the moment. It was as though the very air around them was charged, crackling with the frayed nerves of a world teetering on the edge of something far larger than this traffic stop. Rick's eyes narrowed as Linda stood before him, her posture straight and unwavering. To him, she was an anomaly, a challenge to the assumptions that had shaped his worldview for years. A woman, young, black, and confidently wealthy, was a contradiction in his mind. He had seen people like her before, and he knew exactly what she was. It was simple. She was out of place, and something in her confident demeanor only made him more suspicious. His hand tightened around the collar of his uniform, the friction of his fingers betraying the anger simmering beneath the surface. He wanted her to flinch, wanted her to be afraid. Fear would make her compliant. Fear would make her admit to whatever he suspected, even if he had no reason to think she had done anything wrong. But Linda, standing there with a calm dignity that nearly shattered his perception, wasn't cooperating. She wasn't afraid, she wasn't shrinking into submission as so many others might have. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Rick's voice sliced through the air like a blade, sharp and demanding, a question that held no curiosity, only condemnation. It was as if he expected her to answer with guilt, as if the mere question was enough to assert his superiority. The force of his words was a demand, not a query, as though he had already decided what her response would be, one that fit the mold of his prejudices. Linda's eyes locked onto his, her expression a mirror of serenity amidst the storm. Her lips barely moved as she answered, but the confidence in her words made Rick's chest tighten. "I'm here on business," she said evenly, each syllable measured, as though her presence was unquestionable. The words seemed simple, but to Rick, they rang louder than the sirens blaring from his patrol car. They were a challenge, an affront to the world he had built in his mind, a world where his judgments were unassailable. But Linda's business was not the issue. The issue was her defiance. The issue was the fact that she refused to bow to his authority. The issue was that Linda didn't seem like someone who needed to explain herself to him. Rick's eyes flickered to the Ferrari once more, a symbol of everything he had been taught to distrust. It wasn't just the car, it was the person inside it. Her calmness only fueled the fire of his indignation, her confidence grating against his sense of control. "License and registration," Rick barked, the words coming out like an order rather than a request. The sharpness of his voice cut through the night air, and for a moment, Linda wondered if the very weight of his expectations would crush her. But then she remembered. She had nothing to hide. She reached for her documents, hands steady, her movements deliberate and purposeful. Each gesture spoke volumes. She was in control, no matter what Rick thought or expected. She handed him the paperwork without a second thought, as if this entire exchange were nothing more than a formality. Rick looked down at the papers, but his mind wasn't processing the details. His eyes kept returning to Linda, searching for any sign of fear, any indication that she would break. He found none. Instead, the coolness of her demeanor continued to unsettle him, feeding the fire of his prejudice. When he handed the papers back to her, his frustration was palpable. He couldn't pin her down. couldn't find anything that would validate the anger brewing inside him. She was too calm, too composed. She was different. He stepped back, shaking his head as if to rid himself of the feeling gnawing at him. "You're coming with me," he declared. The words spilled from his mouth with an authority that he wielded like a weapon, and in that moment, the truth of his intentions was clear. This wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. This was about control. This was about proving his dominance over someone who refused to acknowledge his power. Linda's gaze never wavered. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. Her body remained steady, her chin slightly raised, but her voice remained firm as she responded. "On what grounds?" Rick didn't answer right away. The question hit him like a slap in the face, and for the briefest of moments, he faltered. But only for a moment. He wasn't about to be bested by her. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. The words came next, rough and full of conviction. "You're coming with me." He grabbed her arm without warning, his grip forceful, pulling her away from the car, his actions driven by the ugly certainty that he was right. But Linda didn't resist. She didn't struggle. She simply looked at him, eyes sharp, as if she were watching the very unraveling of his prejudices in real time. As he attempted to force the handcuffs on her, Linda stood still, unmoved. The contrast between them couldn't have been more stark. Rick's aggression was like a wildfire, fierce and destructive, while Linda's poise was like the calm before the storm, quiet, unyielding, and powerful in its stillness. "You're making a mistake," Linda said, her voice low but firm, as if she were speaking to a child who had yet to understand the consequences of their actions. The words stung Rick more than he cared to admit, and for a fleeting second, he wondered if she was right. But he shoved that thought aside. He had to be right. He had to prove that his instincts, his power, were justified. At the police station, the confrontation only escalated. Linda was led into the interrogation room, her handcuffs a stark contrast to the calm stillness she exuded. Rick sat across from her, seething, his mind still reeling with questions he couldn't answer. But instead of seeing a woman who was guilty, he began to see the reflection of his own inadequacy. "I think you're so clever, huh?" Rick sneered, leaning forward, trying to provoke a reaction. His words were laced with venom, each syllable dripping with disdain. If you find it interesting, please give the channel a like to motivate us to make more new videos. If you find the story not interesting enough, please comment number 1 to help us improve the content. Sincerely, thank you. Linda met his gaze, unblinking. "I don't think. I know." Her answer was sharp, precise, like a knife cutting through his carefully constructed facade. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't even angry. She simply was. And that, in itself, was a challenge Rick couldn't face. The rhythmic clink of the handcuffs as they hit the table echoed in the room like a steady drumbeat, marking the slow unraveling of everything Rick had believed. But Linda, the quiet storm at the center of it all, remained unmoved. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting an almost sterile glow over the dimly lit interrogation room. The silence between them was thick, a chasm that stretched wider with every passing second. Rick Thompson stood across from Linda Johnson, still fuming, his mind wrestling with a brewing storm of doubt. The anger that had driven him moments ago now gnawed at him, turning his initial conviction into a gnawing sense of uncertainty. But he couldn't back down, not now, not after everything. His reputation was on the line, and his pride wouldn't let him admit the truth. Linda sat silently, her posture unwavering, her eyes locked on him. Despite the handcuffs, she carried herself with a quiet strength, like an immovable rock in the tide. Her calmness only seemed to fuel Rick's frustration. His gut twisted as he wrestled with the unwelcome realization that she wasn't the person he had built her up to be in his mind. She wasn't a criminal or a threat. She was just a woman, a lawyer, one who had done nothing wrong. And yet here she was, shackled, while he, the supposed upholder of justice, clung to his assumptions. "You're not going anywhere until I'm sure about you," Rick finally snapped, his voice laced with frustration. Linda's eyes flickered slightly, a faint recognition of the futility of his words. But she said nothing. She didn't have to. Her silence was a statement in itself, one that seemed to echo louder than any words. She wasn't intimidated, not by his authority, nor by the unjust treatment she was receiving. She knew her rights. She knew her worth. And above all, she knew that this was not about her. This was about the system, the bias that ran through its veins, and the abuse of power that flowed unchecked. Rick stormed out of the room, a storm of frustration swirling around him. He needed to find something, anything, to justify his actions, to affirm his beliefs. His steps were quick, hurried, his mind set on one goal, a reason. He knew that Linda's car had been searched and found empty, but he wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Not when the only thing standing between him and his misplaced certainty was her. As Rick arrived at the car, he looked at it with disdain. There had to be something hidden, something that would make this entire ordeal make sense. He wasn't just stopping here. This search would be thorough, and he would find something, no matter how far he had to stretch the truth to make it work. Meanwhile, Linda sat in the interrogation room, her arms crossed, but her mind was already far beyond this moment. She had long since accepted the grim reality that she was at the mercy of a system designed to favor people like Rick, the powerful, the entrenched. She could feel the weight of history pressing against her, the unrelenting push of years and years of unjust treatment. But Linda had learned something important in her career, in her life as a black woman trying to navigate a world that constantly sought to belittle her. She knew that no matter how many times they tried to break her, she was unbreakable. She thought of the men she was defending, the 3 innocent young men who had been wrongfully accused, whose lives had been shattered by lies and prejudice. She thought of the countless others who had been unjustly locked away, their voices muffled by a system that had long since lost its way. In that moment, Linda didn't just sit there as a lawyer. She sat there as a symbol of the fight for justice. She didn't need to raise her voice because she already embodied the truth. Rick returned to the room, and his expression was one of barely contained anger. He hadn't found anything. His search had yielded nothing that could further his case. The frustration on his face was a portrait of a man who had been caught in his own web. But he wasn't ready to admit defeat. Instead, he returned to his earlier tactic, trying to break Linda's composure, trying to get her to say something, anything, that could justify his own actions. "You still think you're above it all, huh?" Rick's voice was cold, bitter, as if he was trying to provoke a reaction. Linda didn't even flinch. "What do you expect me to say, officer?" Her tone was cool, unbothered, like she was having a conversation with a child who had yet to learn the basics of right and wrong. Rick slammed his hand down on the table, making the sound resonate through the room. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," he growled. "This is about you breaking the law. It's about what you think you're hiding, and I will find it." There it was again. His need to find guilt, even when there was none to find. Linda could see it in his eyes now, his desperation. The system had failed him. It had shown him that Linda, a black woman in a Ferrari, wasn't the villain he had thought she was. And yet, despite all evidence to the contrary, he couldn't let go of his preconceived notions. The idea that she was somehow guilty had taken root in his mind, and no matter how far he had to go, no matter how unjust his actions became, he wouldn't abandon it. Linda remained steady. Her gaze was unwavering, and her voice was even as she replied, "You can search all you want, officer, but I have nothing to hide." Rick's frustration mounted. He had expected her to crack, expected her to show signs of fear, guilt, or even anger. But she was unmoved. No matter what he threw at her, Linda remained an immovable force, a woman who had seen the worst of a system that had long since been tainted, but had never lost her belief in herself, in the righteousness of her cause. Rick didn't understand that. He couldn't see it, because, in his mind, Linda wasn't a person. She was a symbol of everything he hated. She represented all the things he had been taught to fear. She represented the growing unrest, the voices that spoke out against a system that had been built to protect him, but was never meant to protect her. But Linda wasn't concerned with Rick's hatred. She was concerned with what would come next. She knew that her fight wasn't just about her. It was about all the others who had been crushed by the weight of systemic prejudice. She could feel the growing weight of that responsibility on her shoulders, and she wore it without hesitation. "I will not be broken," Linda said, her words as solid as steel, "and I will never stop fighting for justice. Not for me, but for everyone who has been wronged." Rick could see it now. The truth. She wasn't just a woman caught in a moment of injustice. She was a force, a symbol of all the things he had ignored in his rush to judgment. He could feel the guilt, eating at him, gnawing at the edges of his resolve, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. In that moment, he understood the imbalance, the deep-seated injustice, but it was too late for him to turn back. The power he held in his hands felt flimsy now, like a crumbling wall ready to collapse under the weight of the truth. But even as it crumbled, Rick still clung to it, fighting to maintain control over a situation that had already slipped beyond his grasp. Linda's calmness, her quiet strength, had shown him the stark difference between a woman who had nothing to hide and a man who was drowning in the lies he told himself. And as he watched her sit there, unbroken, unyielding, Rick realized that it wasn't just the system that was wrong, it was him. The room was small, suffocating with its sterile walls, and the air felt heavy, laden with unspoken accusations. The cold, flickering light above cast sharp shadows across the floor, highlighting the tension that coiled between Rick Thompson and Linda Johnson. The space seemed to shrink with each passing second, drawing them closer into an unrelenting confrontation, a battle of wits, of will, of worlds that collided in this single room. Rick Thompson paced back and forth, his boots clicking sharply against the floor, the rhythm of his steps echoing in the silence. His hands were clenched into fists, his jaw tight, as though every inch of his body fought against the dawning realization that he had been wrong. His mind, however, refused to concede. Linda sat across from him, still, composed, her back straight, as though the weight of the situation couldn't touch her. In the face of his aggression, she remained unyielding, a rock in the middle of a storm, calm and certain. "You think you can just play me for a fool, don't you?" Rick's voice broke the silence, his tone sharp, accusing. His words were like arrows shot from a distance, meant to wound, to weaken. The longer he stared at her, the more his frustration mounted. She was supposed to be guilty. She was supposed to break. Linda didn't flinch, her gaze unwavering. Her silence wasn't one of submission. It was one of quiet defiance. Her presence seemed to fill the room, her stillness a stark contrast to the chaos that churned in Rick's mind. She had nothing to fear because she knew the truth. And in the face of Rick's biased, unprovoked assault, that truth became her armor. "You have no evidence," Linda said, her voice low, but it resonated in the room, clear and steady. "You can accuse me all you want, but I have not broken any law." Rick's face twisted in disbelief, his fists slamming down onto the table between them with a force that rattled the surface. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you can waltz into my city in that car of yours, flaunting your success, and I won't see through you?" The words were harsh, dripping with disdain. Each one had been painted to make the reader feel something. "You're lying to me. You're hiding something." Linda's lips parted slightly, but she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calmness was more powerful than any outburst. "If you believe I'm lying, prove it." "But you can't, because there's nothing to prove." Rick's hands clenched again, and he leaned in, narrowing his eyes. His breath was shallow, as if each word came with the force of a dam breaking. "Oh, I'll find something. I'll make you talk. You think I don't know your kind? Your type thinks you're above the law, that you're untouchable. You think just because you're educated, just because you've got a fancy car, you can do whatever you want without consequence. I've seen your kind before, and I know exactly what you're hiding." Linda's expression softened slightly, but her eyes burned with the intensity of a woman who had fought this battle before. She wasn't just a lawyer, she was a symbol of justice, a force of reason. "You don't know me," she said, her voice smooth, unbothered by his accusations. "What you see in me is not who I am. What you see in me is your own reflection, your own bias. You're the one who thinks you know my story, that you can judge me based on your narrow view of the world." The room seemed to freeze at her words. Rick's face flushed with a mixture of frustration and anger. She was right, but he couldn't admit that. His entire life, his entire worldview had been built on assumptions like these, and to question them now was to question everything he stood for. But his pride wouldn't let him. "You're arrogant," Rick spat, leaning closer to her, his voice trembling with the force of his rage. "You're nothing but a privileged woman who thinks she's smarter than me. But I'm the one in control here. I hold the power, and you're gonna tell me what I want to hear." Linda's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, her words precise, cutting through his delusions. "Control?" she repeated, her tone almost amused. "You think you have control over me, over my life, just because you're wearing that uniform? You think you can break me with your words, with your power?" She paused for a moment, her gaze piercing into him as though peeling back the layers of his character, revealing the cracks beneath the surface. "You have no power over me, officer. Your badge doesn't give you the right to treat me like this. Your assumptions, your anger, they don't change the fact that I've done nothing wrong." Rick recoiled slightly at her words, as though they stung more than he'd expected. But instead of retreating, he pressed on, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I know what you are. I know the kind of people who think they can just walk into neighborhoods like this, pretending to be something they're not. But I'm telling you right now, I won't let you get away with it. I won't let you walk out of here unscathed." Linda's gaze never left his, the fire in her eyes a silent testament to her unwavering belief in herself and her cause. "I'm not the one who's guilty here, Rick. You are." The words were quiet, but the weight of them hit him like a blow to the chest. His face turned red, his fist slamming once more onto the table, shaking the contents. "You think I'm guilty?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "You think I'm the one who's wrong here?" Linda nodded slowly, her voice still calm, but with an edge that cut through the chaos. "Yes, because your guilt doesn't come from a crime, Rick. It comes from the assumptions you've built about people like me. It comes from the hate that you carry inside you. The idea that people who don't look like you, who don't live like you, don't deserve the same respect. That's where your guilt lies, and you won't ever be free of it until you let go of the hate that clouds your judgment." Rick opened his mouth to speak, but his words caught in his throat. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. It was fleeting, but it was there, an echo of his own growing realization that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong all along. Linda's voice softened, but it carried the weight of a lifetime's experience. "You're trapped, Rick. You're trapped in a system that teaches you to fear and judge people who are different from you. But you can break free. You can choose to be better. Rick recoiled as if struck. The walls of his conviction cracked ever so slightly, but he wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. He was too entrenched in his pride, in his version of the truth. Linda leaned back in her chair, the slightest hint of a smile on her lips. Not one of triumph, but one of understanding. She had said all she could, and for the first time, Rick didn't feel like the one in control. The courtroom was a battleground, its sterile walls standing like silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. The air was thick with anticipation, each breath a reminder of the stakes that had been set in motion long before Linda Johnson had walked through its doors. What began as a single moment of injustice, one officer's decision to break the law, had become a flame that ignited the hearts of a community. It wasn't just Linda's fight anymore. It was the fight of every person who had ever been wronged by a biased system. And outside the courthouse, a storm was gathering, one of unity, of collective will, of the unstoppable force of hope. Linda stood tall in the defendant's chair, her back straight and her heart unwavering. She was no longer just a woman fighting against an officer's prejudice. She was the embodiment of justice, a force of nature fueled by the weight of history. The tension in the room was palpable, like the moment before a lightning strike. Rick Thompson sat across from her, his brow furrowed, the ever-present unease now twisted into something deeper, something akin to guilt. The case had taken on a life of its own, far beyond his ability to control. The judge's gavel rang out, the sound slicing through the air, a solemn reminder that the courtroom, for all its formality, was a place where the truth had to be laid bare. Linda's lawyer stood, his voice booming with the fervor of someone who knew this battle was bigger than legalese and statutes. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, the words rolling off his tongue with the force of a tide. "What we are witnessing here is not merely a case of one officer's overreach. This is a representation of the systems that have long allowed such abuse to fester unchecked. This is not about one woman or one officer. This is about every individual whose rights have been trampled under the heavy boot of prejudice." Linda, sitting quietly, felt a surge of energy flood through her, a mixture of quiet resolve and the quiet support of every person outside those walls, every face pressed against the glass of the courtroom's heavy doors. She felt them with her, the faces of the oppressed, the unheard, the silenced. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone, and that knowledge wrapped around her like a warm blanket, steadying her for what was to come. Outside, a sea of people gathered, their voices rising like a chorus, chanting for justice. The crowd was a vibrant mosaic of humanity, young and old, black and white, male and female, their faces reflecting the very diversity Linda had always fought for. The media captured every moment, every word spoken by the protesters. As the world looked on, it was no longer just a legal case, it had become a movement, a statement against the system that had long turned a blind eye to the injustices committed under its nose. "Justice for Linda!" The chant echoed in the streets, loud and insistent, the rhythm of the words pounding through the very heart of the city. Justice for all. The crowd swelled, a living, breathing entity that pulsed with determination, with hope. Linda's heart swelled as she heard the sounds of solidarity rising up around her. The battle she had fought alone had now become the fight of many. The strength of the community, once a quiet undercurrent, was now a tidal wave. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to silence. The media buzzed with headlines, reporters rushing to capture the spirit of the moment. Each story, each broadcast, calling out the injustice. It was no longer just about the broken officer or the misguided arrest. It was about change, about the power of standing together and demanding that the system be held accountable for its failures. Inside the courtroom, Linda's lawyer continued to speak with passion, his words a powerful melody of truth. "This isn't about criminal charges anymore," he said, his voice steady. "This is about dismantling the walls that have kept the truth buried for too long. This is about a system that has failed, and it's about time we all stand up and make it right." The words were a clarion call, rising above the sterile air of the courtroom like the first notes of a symphony, soaring with the promise of justice. Linda knew it wasn't over yet. The journey was far from finished, but she felt the weight of it shifting. The public support was more than just a rallying cry. It was the force that would propel her forward, no matter how many walls they tried to put in her way. No matter how many doubted her, there were thousands more who believed in her. They believed in the fight for justice, for equality, for fairness, and that belief was stronger than any obstacle. Outside, the crowd grew larger, its voices swelling like a storm, a force that could not be ignored. "We are the change," they cried, their words more than just a chant. They were a promise. They were the living embodiment of every person who had ever felt invisible, dismissed, overlooked. And in that moment, they were seen. Inside, the tension was palpable. Rick Thompson, though seated behind his defense, seemed to shrink with each passing moment. The weight of his actions, the weight of his unchecked power, pressed on him like an unbearable burden. His gaze shifted nervously between Linda and the members of the jury, each of them now becoming a silent judge of his conscience. He could no longer deny the truth that had been staring him in the face from the very beginning, that Linda, in her quiet dignity, had become the symbol of everything he had failed to see. And the community, their voices rising, was a reminder that their support had shifted the scales of justice in her favor. In the end, it wasn't just about winning a case. It was about winning the fight for the soul of the system itself. Linda's victory was a victory for all who had been wronged by the system's deeply rooted bias. It was a moment when the voices of the people rose louder than the forces of oppression, when the truth became the loudest sound in the room. Linda stood, her expression unwavering, as the judge finally called for a verdict. The room was electric with expectation, and outside the crowd hushed, waiting for the moment that would mark the beginning of change. Linda's eyes, though tired, burned with the fierce light of hope. For the first time in a long while, it felt like the world was listening. And they were no longer afraid to fight for what was right. This was just the beginning. The days following the trial were long and heavy, each one dragging Rick Thompson deeper into a quiet, suffocating place where the world seemed to close in on him. The weight of the courtroom verdict, the eyes of the public, and the voices that had risen in unison against him. The noise was deafening, and yet the silence inside his mind was even louder. It was a silence that pressed in from all sides, a constant reminder of his failure, not just as an officer, but as a person. For the first time, Rick allowed himself to stop and reflect, truly reflect on everything that had led up to this moment. His mind replayed the events over and over, each harsh word he'd spoken to Linda, each decision he had made that now, in the quiet of his own conscience, felt like a betrayal. The once clear image of Linda Johnson as a suspect had faded away. Now all he could see was her face, the calm, unshaken face that had stared him down in the interrogation room. And beneath that calmness, he saw something else, something that had eluded him before. Strength. Strength that had nothing to do with force, but everything to do with the power of standing firm in the face of unjust authority. Rick's guilt was like a shadow, always following him, growing longer as the days passed. It was a weight that had begun to sink into his bones, slowly, steadily, until it had become a part of him, a constant companion in his solitude. He couldn't escape it. He sat in his apartment one evening, alone with the stark silence of the room, his mind a mess of conflicting emotions. The television was on, muted, the news anchor's lips moving in silent commentary. Rick's eyes were glazed, unfocused. He was staring at the screen, but his thoughts were elsewhere. On Linda, on the trial, on everything he had believed before, and everything he had come to understand now. The words of Captain Harrison echoed in his mind. What Officer Thompson and others have done is a betrayal of their oath. The words rang like a bell inside his head, reverberating in the hollow spaces of his guilt. Betrayal. It was the one word that kept surfacing, the word that made his stomach turn. He had sworn an oath to protect and serve, but instead, he had served his own prejudice, his own assumptions, and he had failed to protect a woman who had done nothing wrong. He had failed to protect both the woman who had done nothing wrong. He had failed to protect a woman who had done nothing wrong. The silence in the room seemed to press down on him, suffocating him in its weight. Rick could feel the walls closing in around him, the echoes of his mistakes bouncing off every corner. He tried to shake it off, tried to push it away, but the guilt, his guilt, was a constant reminder, like a physical ache that wouldn't subside. It wasn't just the trial that had left him feeling empty, it was the aftermath, the realization that he had been a part of something far larger and darker than he had ever realized. The community's outcry, the faces of the people who stood with Linda, demanding justice, that was something Rick had never seen before. It had been a force, a tidal wave of voices that could not be ignored, that tore down the walls he had built around his own ignorance. Linda's calmness had pierced through his arrogance. Her quiet dignity had shattered his preconceived notions, and the people had rallied around her, calling for accountability. And as much as Rick wanted to believe he was still in control, deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't him who had stood tall in the face of injustice. It wasn't him who had been the symbol of strength, the embodiment of justice. It had been Linda, and it had been the people, the ones he had disregarded, who had shown him what true power looked like. Rick's hands trembled as he ran them over his face, feeling the weight of the day's events crash down on him once more. The guilt was suffocating. He couldn't escape it, not in the silence of his apartment, not in the chaos of the world outside. It was inescapable, like the air he breathed, like the very blood that coursed through his veins. The image of Linda's face was still vivid in his mind, but now it was different. He no longer saw her as the other, the person he had unfairly judged. Now, all he saw was a woman who had done what was right in the face of everything that was wrong. She had stood firm while he had been the one to crumble. The weight of that realization pressed against him, and it hurt more than any physical pain he had ever known. But guilt, as crushing as it was, wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something else, and Rick knew that somewhere deep inside him, the realization had begun to settle in. It was up to him to atone for his actions. He couldn't undo what had been done, couldn't erase the pain he had caused, but he could choose to be better. He could choose to change. The doorbell rang, snapping him from his thought. His heart skipped a beat as he slowly rose to his feet, his body heavy with the weight of the moment. When he opened the door, standing on the other side was the last person he expected to see. Linda Johnson stood there, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of them in that single, charged moment. Rick opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He wasn't sure what he could say to make things right. But Linda, to his surprise, didn't wait for him to find the right words. "I'm not here to hear your apology," Linda said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I'm here because I believe in justice. And justice, Rick, is not just about what happens in a courtroom. It's about what happens when we stand up and admit the truth. It's about acknowledging where we've gone wrong and doing something to fix it." She paused, and her eyes met his, her gaze steady and unyielding. "I'm here because you still have a choice. You have the power to change. But that change, Rick, has to come from within you. You can't run from this. Not anymore." Rick swallowed hard, his throat tight. He nodded, the weight of her words sinking deep into his chest, heavier than any shame he had ever known. He stepped back, allowing her to enter his apartment, not because he wanted to explain himself, but because in that moment he realized that his journey for redemption had to begin somewhere. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid to face the truth, the guilt, the mistakes. They would always be there, but now it was his choice to do something with them. And as Linda stepped into the room, her presence was no longer one of confrontation, but of possibility. A possibility of redemption, a possibility of change. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on Linda Johnson as she stood before the jury, her posture tall and unwavering. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, thick with the expectations of a city, of a community, and of every person who had stood behind her in this fight for justice. This was not just the end of her case. It was the beginning of something far larger. It was a battle not just for her own dignity, but for the dignity of every person who had been wronged by a system that had forgotten the meaning of equality. She took a slow, steady breath, feeling the full magnitude of what was at stake. She could feel the eyes of the jurors on her, the scrutiny of the public, the collective weight of all those voices demanding change. She glanced at Rick Thompson, sitting across from her, the man who had once seen her as nothing more than a target of his prejudice, and now, perhaps, the man who was beginning to see the truth. Her voice broke the silence, calm but resonant, as if each word were carefully chosen and filled with the weight of generations of suffering. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I stand before you today not just as a lawyer, but as a symbol of a system that has failed far too many, a system that, for far too long, has bent its power against the people it was meant to protect. But we are here today to change that." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room, each word sinking in, each sentence anchoring her truth into the very soul of the courtroom. "I am not here to tell you that I am a perfect person. I am not here to ask for sympathy or pity. What I ask for is something far more important. Justice. Justice for me, yes, but more importantly, justice for every single person who has ever been made to feel invisible, to feel lesser than, to feel like a man cannot glimpse a portion of the truth in life alone. I am not here to tell you that I am a perfect person who has ever been made to feel invisible, to feel lesser than, to feel like their voice doesn't matter." Linda's words were not just directed at the jury, they were a call to every person listening, every person watching, to those who had been harmed by the broken system. Her voice was the steady drumbeat of a revolution that was about more than legal victories. It was about hearts and minds. It was about change. "Justice is not a gift we are given," she continued, her words picking up strength with every beat. "Justice is not something that can be handed down from the powers that be. Justice is something we must fight for. We must claim it. We must demand it with every ounce of strength we have. And when we stand together as a united front, we are unstoppable. When we come together to demand what is right, there is no force in this world that can stand against us." The rhythm of her speech matched the intensity in the room, her words carrying the power of a storm gathering force. "I am here to tell you that the system we have trusted for too long has failed us. It has failed me. It has failed every single one of you who has ever been pushed aside, ignored, or forgotten. But the time for silence has passed. The time for complacency has passed. It is time to stand up and say, we will not be ignored. We will not be silenced. We will no longer allow the chains of prejudice and bias to bind us. She let the words hang in the air for a moment, her chest rising and falling with each breath, every word wrapped in the emotion of everything she had fought for. The man sitting across from me today, she said, her gaze turning toward Rick, may have believed that he was doing his job, but in his mind he carried a weapon far more dangerous than any gun or baton. He carried his own bias, his own assumptions, his own hate. And with those he shattered my rights and my dignity. But it is not just my dignity that was shattered. It is the dignity of every person who has ever been treated as less than. It is the dignity of every person who has ever been treated as less than. It is the dignity of every person who has ever been treated as less than. It is the dignity of every person who has ever been treated as less than. He is a novice, but by what someone else thought they should be. Linda's voice cracked just slightly, the raw emotion of the moment breaking through, but she quickly regained her composure. She had no time for weakness. The fight for justice was too urgent. I stand here not for myself, but for the generations before me who fought so hard for the rights that were promised but never truly given. I stand here for the ones who have come after me, who will have to continue the fight. And I stand here for everyone whose voice has ever been silenced, whose spirit has ever been broken. Because in this room, in this moment, we have the power to change everything. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, not out of anger, but out of the undeniable conviction that what she was saying was true. They could change it. We could change it. Together, there was nothing that could stand in their way. She took another slow, steady breath, grounding herself, feeling the energy of the crowd outside the courtroom fill her heart. I ask you, the jury, to look beyond what you have been told. Look beyond the uniforms, beyond the titles, beyond the lies that have been told to us for generations. What I am asking for is simple. I am asking you to see me as I am, a human being, deserving of dignity and respect. I ask you to look at the system that has failed us and ask yourselves, is this the world we want to live in? Is this the world we want to leave behind for our children? Linda's voice softened, but the power of her words only deepened. This trial is not just about punishing those who have done wrong. It's about restoring faith in the rule of law. It's about ensuring that we never again allow prejudice to cloud our judgment. It's about showing the world that justice is not something we can take for granted, but something we must fight for, something that we must demand with every fiber of our being. Her final words echoed through the courtroom like a bell ringing, clear and resonant, carrying the weight of everything she stood for. I ask you not just to deliver a verdict. I ask you to deliver justice. And when you do, know that you are not just changing my life. You are changing the course of history. Linda stepped back from the podium, her eyes steady, her heart resolute. The jury sat before her, the decision in their hands. But in that moment, the decision was not just theirs. It was everyone's. It was the world's. And Linda knew with absolute certainty that justice would prevail. The courtroom had grown still, as though it too was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. A sense of finality hung in the air, thick with the weight of the battle that had been fought and the moments that had led them all here. Outside, the sky had begun to darken, as if nature itself were reflecting the storm brewing in the hearts of those who stood on either side of the case. Rick Thompson sat in his chair, shoulders slumped, hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. His once assured posture had collapsed, replaced by a man whose foundation had cracked beneath him. The words Linda had spoken, the truth she had laid bare, had reverberated in his mind like a hammer striking against his pride. He had believed in his righteousness, in the idea that his actions had been justified. But now, those beliefs felt like fragile glass, shattered by the weight of his own guilt. He had never seen it coming. The walls he had built around himself, the walls of his authority, of his bias, of his indifference, were slowly crumbling, piece by piece. His eyes flickered nervously toward the jury, their faces unreadable, their expressions distant. The realization that their decision was no longer in his hands filled him with a hollow dread. The room seemed to close in on him. Every breath he took felt heavier than the last. The truth of what he had done, the injustice he had inflicted on Linda, the harm he had perpetuated with every prejudiced word, every unfair action, was now undeniable. It was the kind of weight that crushed a man's soul, leaving nothing behind but the broken remnants of his own pride. In the corner of the room, Linda stood tall, her presence as powerful as the very ideals she represented. She had been a symbol of strength throughout this trial, but now, in the face of Thompson's unraveling, she became something more, a symbol of hope. It was a hope that didn't just belong to her, but to the thousands of people who had stood with her in this fight for justice. It was a hope that transcended this moment, that stretched forward to a future where such injustices no longer had a place. Her eyes met Rick's for a fleeting moment, and in that brief exchange, she saw it, the crumbling of the walls he had built around himself. There was no triumph in her gaze, no satisfaction. She knew what it felt like to be caught in the grip of a system that had failed her. But her victory was never about making others feel the same pain. It was about ensuring that this moment of reckoning, was the beginning of change. She had won, not because she was right, but because she had fought. And in fighting, she had become something greater than herself. She had become the voice for those who couldn't speak, the embodiment of a future where justice wasn't a privilege but a right. The jury filed back into the room, their collective decision hanging in the air like the moment before a storm. The foreman stood and cleared his throat, his gaze flicking toward Linda and Rick as he spoke, the words hanging in the space between them like a heavy cloud. We, the jury, find Officer Rick Thompson guilty of unlawful arrest, misconduct, and abuse of power. The words landed like a heavy blow, reverberating through the room with an almost physical weight. Rick's face drained of color, the last bit of confidence he had left evaporating into thin air. The shame of the verdict was more than just a sting of public humiliation. It was the realization that his actions, his blind adherence to bias, his willingness to impose his will without regard for justice, had been exposed for all to see. He had been caught not by the law but by the truth, and now he was forced to face the consequences. Linda, on the other hand, stood with her head held high, her eyes focused on the jury as they delivered their verdict. There was no triumph in her expression, only the quiet certainty that justice had been served. She had faced down an entire system of oppression and prejudice, and she had emerged victorious. But her victory wasn't about her personal gain. It was about the collective good. It was about everyone who had ever been wronged and everyone who would be wronged in the future, knowing that there was still hope, that there was still a chance for things to change. As Rick was led away in handcuffs, the room seemed to take on a new energy, as though the very air had shifted. There was no celebration, no applause, but there was a collective sense of relief. The heavy weight of injustice that had hung in the air for so long had finally lifted, and in its place, there was the feeling of something new, something that had been waiting, simmering just beneath the surface. Hope. outside the courthouse, the streets had erupted in cheers. The people, those who had supported Linda throughout the trial, those who had marched and protested, who had raised their voices for justice, had come together to celebrate this moment. It wasn't just Linda's victory. It was their victory, the victory of everyone who had ever been made to feel small, unheard, or invisible. Linda emerged from the courthouse, her eyes shielded by dark sunglasses, but her face was unmistakable. She had fought, and now she had won, not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced. The crowd cheered, their voices rising in a chorus of solidarity. This was the change they had been fighting for. This was the future they had dreamed of, where justice wasn't a rarity, but a certainty. Linda stepped forward, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, and raised her hand in a simple gesture of acknowledgement. But it wasn't the gesture of a conqueror. It was the gesture of someone who knew that this fight wasn't over. The battle for justice would continue, but this victory was a reminder to all who had fought beside her. It was possible. Change was possible. Rick Thompson's downfall was not just a personal defeat. It was a victory for every person who had ever felt the sting of discrimination, for every person who had been wronged by a system that had failed them. And in Linda's rise, the message was clear. Justice was not just about the individual, it was about the collective, the power of a community that stood united in the face of wrongdoing, and the strength of those who refused to let the darkness of prejudice define their future. The courtroom had been the battleground, but the real war was just beginning, and Linda, with the strength of an unyielding spirit, was ready for whatever came next. In the wake of her victory, the streets outside the courthouse buzzed with energy, but Linda Johnson knew that the cheers would not last forever. Justice had been served, yes, but only in this moment. It was a victory, a powerful one, but it was only the beginning. Justice, as Linda had learned in her own journey, was not something to be handed out on a silver platter. It was something to be fought for, every day, in every corner of society. She walked through the crowd, the sea of people parting before her like a river splitting in two, yet her thoughts remained with the road ahead. The warmth of the sun against her face was comforting, but it was the weight of the future that truly held her attention. This was the world she had fought for, a world where justice wasn't a prize for the lucky few, but a birthright for all. And yet, as the echoes of victory rang out, Linda knew that the real fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Linda's journey had started as a lone battle against an unjust system, but now she was no longer fighting alone. The people who had rallied behind her, the ones who had walked the streets in protest, who had raised their voices in unison, were her strength. Together, they were a collective force, united, unwavering, and unstoppable. The wave of change was ongoing, rippling through the very fabric of the nation. Justice, Linda knew, was not just a legal concept. It was a living, breathing entity, a force that could not be tamed or contained. It was something that demanded action, demanded change, and she was ready to answer that call. As she stood before the crowd, her heart swelling with pride, Linda's voice rang out clear and strong, cutting through the noise of celebration. "This victory is not just mine," she began, her words sharp and precise, yet filled with a warmth that reached out to every person who had supported her. "This is a victory for all of us, for everyone who has been ignored, for everyone who has been ignored, for everyone who has been wronged by a system that was never designed to protect them." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Linda's voice did not falter. She stood tall, her hands lifted, not as a leader, but as a representative of the people. But this is only the beginning, she continued, her tone unwavering. This is just the first step in a journey that has no end. The fight for justice doesn't stop here. It will never stop until we have built a society where every person, no matter their skin, no matter their background, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. Her words echoed like a bell ringing across the crowd, each syllable vibrating with the promise of change, with the power of truth. The fight for justice would continue. It would continue not just in the courts, but in the streets, in the schools, in the places where decisions were made that affected the lives of those who had no voice. Justice would live in every act of kindness, every challenge to the status quo, every stand taken in the face of inequality. She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in, as if the very air around them had thickened with purpose. "The road to equality is long," she said softly, "but it is a road we must walk together. We cannot afford to be complacent. We cannot afford to sit back and wait for change to come to us. We must be the change. We must push forward, no matter how difficult, no matter how many times we are knocked down, because justice is worth the fight." The crowd hushed in that moment, as if taking in every word, every ounce of meaning that had been poured into those sentences. It was a moment of understanding, a collective recognition of what needed to be done, of the work that lay ahead. And in that silence, Linda felt the weight of the future settle around her. It was a weight she had long ago accepted, a weight that she wore like armor. As she looked out over the crowd, Linda's eyes shone with a new sense of purpose. The victory she had earned was not an end but a starting point. The justice that had been served in the courtroom would now spread into every part of society. It was not a gift, it was a demand that no one could ignore. The journey, Linda knew, would not be easy. There would be resistance, there would be setbacks, but the fire that burned within her was unrelenting. It was a fire that could not be extinguished, no matter the storms that raged around it. Justice, like the flame, had the power to spread, slowly at first, but then faster, fiercer, until it was a force to be reckoned with. And Linda would be at the heart of it, guiding the flame, pushing it forward into every corner of society that had been overlooked and forgotten. "Today, we stand together," she said, her voice rising once again, strong and filled with the hope of 1,000 possibilities. "Tomorrow, we fight again. For every person who has been ignored, for every voice that has been silenced, for every soul that has been broken by the weight of injustice. We will fight for a world where no one is treated as less than, where everyone has the right to be seen, to be heard, to be valued." The crowd erupted again, their voices rising in unison, a chorus of hope, of defiance, of strength. The sound was like the breaking of chains, the shattering of the old, tired walls that had kept so many locked in place. And in that moment, Linda knew that the fight for justice wasn't just a matter of courtrooms and laws. It was a matter of hearts, of minds, of the very spirit of humanity. She turned and walked back toward the podium, her heart full of pride, her feet steady and sure. The path ahead was long, but with every step, Linda knew that she wasn't walking alone. She was walking with a movement, with a collective will that could not be silenced, and together they would change the world. The fight for justice was not over, it had only just begun. And Linda Johnson was ready to lead it, to carry the flame, to fight for every person who deserved to be treated with dignity. She would not stop. She could not stop. Because this was a fight that was bigger than her, bigger than any one person. This was a fight for the soul of society, and she would see it through to the end. Thank you again for following this story. Let it not only be an inspiring story, but also a reminder of the power of change, that every action we take can contribute to a more just world. Please continue to follow and share this story with those around you, because we can be part of this revolution. Justice is not a gift, but a right that we must fight for. Thank you, and see you in the next story.